the first 9 verses, Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. If you're visiting with us tonight, we're very glad that you're here. I ask you to study along with us. If anybody has a question about anything that I talk about tonight, then please let me know following the service. Joshua 1, beginning with verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and of the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you, nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage. For to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it, for then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Here are 2 things God did. God chose and God promised. God chose. As He had chosen Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt and across the Red Sea, so He chose Joshua to lead them across the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan. And then God promised Joshua the land of Canaan. God promised Joshua His presence, that as He had been with Moses, He would be with him, and that He would never leave him or forsake him. And God promised Joshua His power, so that his enemies in the land of Canaan would not be able to stand against him. All right, that's what God did. God chose and God promised. Joshua's part was faith. The faith to trust that God would deliver on His promise that goes all the way back to Abraham, all the way back to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 7, when God promised Abraham that his descendants would be given this land, the land of Canaan. Joshua's part was faith, the faith to trust that God would deliver on His promise, to always be with him, and to fight against his enemies. And his part was faith, that is, the faith to be strong and courageous, to stay with God's Word, to not turn from it to the right hand or to the left. So I want us to think for a little while tonight about the faith of Joshua in the different stages of his life. Some of you tonight, you are in the early years of your life. Some of us are in the latter years of life. And then others are in the middle years. But whatever our stage of life, we can learn so much from the faith of Joshua. First, let's think about Joshua's faith in his earlier years. Nowhere is Joshua's faith more evident than it is in Numbers chapter 14. We're familiar with the story, most of us are, how Moses sent the 12 spies to spy out the land of Canaan. 10 of them came back with a very, very negative report. They were overwhelmed by what they saw. And in Numbers chapter 13, as we look at verse 25, Numbers 13 and verse 25, it says, "And they returned from spying out the land after 40 days. So then they gave their report. In verse 28, it says, well, the land really does flow with milk and honey. It is a good land, just as God has promised. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there." So we drop down to verse 30 and we find that Caleb is trying to quiet the people. And he says, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." The latter part of verse 32, it says, "All the people whom we saw in it are men of great stature." There we saw, you say they kept talking about what they saw there. We saw the giants, the descendants of Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in their own sight, and so we were in their sight. But Joshua and Caleb, they came back with a very optimistic report. And it says in Numbers chapter 14, verse 6 beginning, "But Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, 'The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then He'll bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread.'" Another way of saying that would be, they are our prey. "Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Now, Joshua and Caleb, they saw the obstacles too. They saw the obstacles just like the other 10 spies. But what separated Joshua and Caleb from the other 10 was their faith. It led them to stand against not only the 10 spies, but their faith led them to stand against the whole congregation of the children of Israel, because the whole congregation of Israel had been influenced by the other 10 spies. And so we just read there in verse 10 that all the congregation said to stone them with stones. God rewarded the faith of Joshua and Caleb. They were the only men of their generation who were permitted by God to enter that good land. You know, Joshua's association with Moses as he was a younger man must have assisted him greatly in the development of his faith. Young people, just think of an older person whose faith you truly admire. Would constant association with that person in your formative years have any bearing at all, do you think, on the development of your faith? You know that it would. Now think of Joshua's experiences with Moses while he was Moses' assistant, as he's called there in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 1. Not long after the departure from Egypt, Joshua ascended with Moses into Mount Sinai to meet the Lord. That's in Exodus 24. He saw how Joshua saw how Moses dealt with the people when they sinned by making the golden calf. He saw how Moses dealt with the congregation of the children of Israel when they complained against Moses and against God in the wilderness. Without doubt, Moses helped shape the faith of Joshua in the earlier years of Joshua's life. The faith of Joshua was evident even in his earlier years when he was Moses' assistant. But then think about Joshua's faith in his middle years. His faith led him to be a willing leader of God's people. So we read in Joshua chapter 1, God said to Joshua, Joshua, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now you lead. And that's Joshua 1, 1 through 9, where he commissions Joshua to lead his people. And then what do we read? Joshua 1, verse 10 and verses following indicate that Joshua began immediately to make preparations for the crossing of the Jordan River, for preparations of the work that was ahead. But you know, other great men that we read about in the Bible who were called by God, they were reluctant at first. Even the great Moses, when he was commissioned by God, was reluctant. One of the things that we remember that Moses said was, well, I am not eloquent. I just can't speak well. And then even the prophet Jeremiah, great prophet, but even Jeremiah, when he was called by God, was reluctant at first. While Moses said, I'm not eloquent, Jeremiah said, I'm too young. You know, if Joshua ever offered even one excuse, it's not recorded. The very fact that Joshua was willing to go into enemy territory and lead God's people says volumes, I think, about the faith of Joshua and his faith in God. And then his faith led him to consistently glorify God for success. Their success in crossing the Jordan River. In the book of Joshua, chapter 3, and in verse 1, Joshua 3, verse 1, it says, Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and they set out from Acacia Grove and came to the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they crossed over. So now they've come to the Jordan. Later in this chapter, Joshua chapter 3, we're actually going to read the account of the children of Israel, led by Joshua and the Ark of the Covenant, crossing the Jordan River. But before they crossed the Jordan River, in verse 5, Joshua 3:5, Joshua said to the people, Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Before they crossed the Jordan River then, Joshua said to the people whom he was leading, Get ready, consecrate, sanctify yourselves. The Lord is about to do some amazing things. And then we read about the miracle that God performed, enabling them to cross the Jordan River. In the taking of Jericho, we see that he attributed their success to God. In Joshua chapter 6 and verse 16, after they had marched around the city of Jericho once each day, or 7 days, seventh day, they marched around the city 7 times. The priest blew on the ram's horns. The people shouted when they were told to shout. And it says in Joshua chapter 6:16, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." He said, the Lord has done it. Joshua knew full well that they were not able to take the city of Jericho because of the military might that they had. But he knew that they had taken the city of Jericho because of God's might. The Lord has given the city unto us. And then Joshua's faith led him to have the respect of the people he led. Going back to Joshua chapter 3, Joshua 3 and verse 7. And this is right after Joshua told the people to get ready, sanctify yourselves. Tomorrow the Lord's going to do amazing things. In verse 7, the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you." He said, this day the Lord will exalt you, Joshua, in the sight of the people. The miracle of crossing the Jordan River would validate Joshua as God's appointed leader. Later on in chapter 4 and verse 14, now by this time the Jordan River has been crossed by the power of God. But then in verse 14 of Joshua 4, on that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel. And they feared him. That is, they revered him, the New American Standard Bible says. They feared him. They revered him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life. Well, Joshua acquired the respect of the people he led. But Joshua had a part to play in that. It wasn't just because of what God had done. Although what God had done in the miraculous crossing of the Jordan River, yes, that validated Joshua as God's appointed leader. But when it says the people had respect for Joshua, Joshua had a part to play in it. All of Israel could see that Joshua chose to lead with God. And they could see that Joshua was a man of great faith, whom God had chosen as their leader. God wouldn't have chosen him had he not been a man of that kind of faith. And the people knew about the faith of Joshua. But then, think about Joshua's faith in his latter years. In the book of Joshua, chapter 23, Joshua 23, verses 1 and 2. Now it came to pass a long time after the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies around about, that Joshua was old, advanced in age. And Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, for their heads, for their judges, and for their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in age. No doubt, when we're reading about Joshua now, he was in the latter years of his life. He must have been well over 100 years old at this time in Joshua chapter 23 and then on into chapter 24. This is what we commonly refer to as Joshua's farewell address. Later in Joshua chapter 24, we're going to read that Joshua died at the age of 110. No doubt when he was giving this address then, he was well over 100 years old. And here in his latter years, Joshua's concerns were not military. His concerns were not political. His concerns were not economic. Joshua's concerns were spiritual. His last speech, his very last speech to Israel was an exhortation to be faithful to the true God who had given them the land of Canaan. In Joshua 24, verses 14 and 15, Joshua said, as part of his farewell address, "Now therefore fear the Lord, serve Him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Those words reflected the faith and courage that had characterized this great man all his life. He had the faith and the courage to make an independent choice. Years before, as we've already seen, as we went back to the book of Numbers, many years before, in Joshua's earlier years, he stood with one man, Caleb. He stood with one man against the whole nation of Israel, insisting that with God's help they could conquer Canaan. Now, he was aware of the likelihood that the whole nation would just drift into idolatry, which they did. But Joshua said, "But as for me and my house, regardless of what the whole nation may do, as for me and my house, and we will serve the Lord." What others did would not alter Joshua's decision. What if you had been there on that day when Joshua gave that farewell address as recorded in the last two chapters of the book of Joshua? What if you had been there that day and you were wavering? You were straddling the fence. Do you think you might have been strengthened by his faithful leadership? And do you think that the faith and the courage that Joshua lived in front of those people day in and day out made them respect him when he gave those last words, the words of this dying man in Joshua chapters 23 and 24? In the recording of his death, he is simply referred to as the servant of the Lord. Joshua chapter 24, verse 29. "Now it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old." You know, all the way back in the book of Exodus, you look at Joshua's earlier years, Exodus chapter 33 and verse 11. That verse uses the word servant to describe Joshua when he was, quote, a young man. Those words are there in Exodus 33, verse 11. A young man. Joshua was a young man. But the word that was used to describe him even then is the word servant. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that throughout his life, Joshua had the heart of a faithful servant. All right, now here are some things that we learn from Joshua's faith. One thing we learn from his faith is that faith needs to be developed during the early years. You recall when you go to 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5, how that Paul spoke of the sincere faith that was in Timothy, which he said dwelt first in your grandmother and in your mother, so that Timothy was at least a third generation believer. But Timothy never had an inherited faith. He wasn't what he was just because of Lois and Eunice. He wasn't that because of their faith. It was because of his faith. Timothy, I'm talking about. Because in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, Paul draws attention to the fact that Timothy had learned the truth. And that from childhood, he had known the Holy Scriptures. Timothy's faith was rooted in what he learned from childhood, Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 3. And his faith was rooted in the Scriptures. Young people, cultivate your own faith so that you'll make decisions based on what's right. Regardless of what culture dictates, regardless of what it might cost, regardless of what the majority says or does, but have the faith so that you can say, but as for me, this is what I will do. As for me, this is my decision. Because an inherited faith just will not do. It cannot carry you through life with the temptations and the snares and the trials of this life. So that's one thing we learned from Joshua's faith. Faith needs to be developed during the early years. Another thing we learn, we need strong faith during the transitional years. When the transitional years, when so many things in our lives are changing. We're starting a career. We're starting a family. And then life gets really crazy. It gets really busy. And sometimes we allow our lives to get busier than we should allow them to get. We need to make service to the Lord the goal for our families. I didn't say we need to make service to the Lord a goal, or one of the goals, or even one of the primary goals. I said we need to make service to the Lord the goal for our families. Not that our children gain wealth and success as the world defines it, but that our house will serve the Lord. Folks, when we are fully devoted to the right goal, I said fully, when we're fully devoted to the right goal, then our lives will not get busier than they should with the things of this world. And then we need faith that will enable us to die well. We read some of the great men and women of the Bible, great men and women of faith, and how they died. Abraham's one of them. In the book of Genesis chapter 25, verses 7 and 8, it says, "This is the sum of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people." And where the New King James says, he died an old man and full of years, the New American Standard Bible says he died an old man and satisfied with life. Satisfied with life. Abraham died well. And then sometime after Joshua's farewell address, again in Joshua 24 and verse 29, "Now it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old." You know, I don't care anything about living to 110. I don't care about that. Don't care a thing about that. And in fact, I'd probably rather not. But I care what I do care about. And that is, I want to die as a servant of the Lord, regardless of when I die. I put this sermon together because I was assigned this topic as I am about to speak in Greenwood, the Northside Church in Greenwood, this coming Wednesday night. And I'm taking part in what they refer to as their summer series. Every year during the summer, on Wednesday nights, they invite different speakers to come and speak on a theme. And the theme is faith this summer. And so they assigned me the faith of Joshua. You were my guinea pigs. Well, when this summer series in Greenwood is over, then they will have studied the faith of Moses, Caleb, Abraham and Isaac, Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, Ezekiel, and the Apostle Paul. And I tell you what I'm going to tell the brethren at Greenwood Wednesday night. Let the goal of this series be that you will have a faith that you'll carry with you throughout life, so that when you come to the end, then you can say what the Apostle Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all who have loved His appearing. You know, when I moved to Greenwood in 1977 to preach, I was 24 years old. Wednesday night when I preached there will be a few of them, very few, who were at that congregation when I moved there when I was 24. Well, now I'm 71. We're all going to get old. We're all going to get old unless we die prematurely. The early years, they passed in a hurry. The middle years, they too passed quickly. The latter years will soon be gone. I don't mean to sound morbid, but my latter years will very soon be gone. Let us recognize, as did all of the men and women of faith, that there's a whole lot more to life than just here and now. Prepare to meet God in judgment, because eternity's coming. And eternity might get here very quickly. We don't even know what tomorrow has in store for us. What is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth, the Scriptures say. Make the preparations you need to make tonight. And act on faith, your faith, not somebody else's faith. You can't do that. You can do it, but it won't be God's way. Act on your faith. Won't you demonstrate faith? You know, Joshua's faith, it wasn't just some kind of a non-doing trust, a trust in God that didn't do anything. His faith did plenty and sacrificed greatly in doing the will of God. Will you demonstrate your faith? It's the only faith that saves, James says in James chapter 2. Dead faith won't do it, he said. So please let your faith be demonstrated here tonight in repentance, confession, being baptized for the remission of your